Hi there, my name is Philip Eidson. I want to welcome you to the Art of Procurement podcast, the podcast that helps you, a forward-thinking procurement professional, position yourself and your team to proactively take advantage of the revolution that's taking place in procurement today. By interviewing industry trailblazers and sharing insights from our own experiences, my team and I pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that procurement teams are using to elevate their impact. And this week, I want to share with you a conversation from a recent AOP Live with Joe Payne, Jennifer Ulrich, and Tom Pellescki from Corcentric. And in this episode, hosted by my Art of Procurement partner, Kelly Barner, we dug into the 3 problems that will make your P2P implementation fail. Now, if you're about to start implementing a new P2P technology, or if you've already implemented P2P and it isn't doing what you wanted it to, this is a great episode to help you either avoid making some common mistakes or diagnose the issues that may be causing problems in your current P2P design. So with that being said, let's go straight into today's episode.
So Joe, starting with you, in all of your experience with implementations and transformation, what would you say is the biggest P2P related failure you have seen in your experience?
Sure. The biggest failure is one that I actually see almost every time we start a P2P implementation or a transformation of a procurement or accounts payable function. And that's not really realizing what the letters stand for, right? It's procure to pay. And so when we have a procurement-led procure to pay transformation, very frequently, procurement will dismiss or not really fully think about the AP side of that equation, like the ingestion of invoices and the supplier management that is involved from accounts payable. And on the AP side or the finance side, it's very often an oversimplification of the procurement piece of that. And so when I talk to procurement leaders after a transformation, I say, what did you wish you would have known going into this that you didn't know? And I would say if it's not 90%, it would be more than 90% of the time. What I hear is how complex the AP side of this is. I wish I brought it in earlier. I wish they were a partner with me on this transformation. And when I talk to finance, it's almost the opposite of that, because finance often goes in saying, oh, we're going to fix our procurement process as part of this. For example, we're going to implement no PO, no pay. But they're oversimplifying, right? Because implementing that type of change in an organization is not something that is necessarily all that easy to do. So I'd say the biggest failure is not thinking about both sides of that equation. And so the important takeaways on that are, 1, it has to be collaborative. It has to be a joint project between those 2 groups if they're separate today. And secondly, you need executive sponsorship. These are big projects. These are big changes. And you need senior people involved in it to help drive change and to get it done right.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, it's simply 3 characters, right? But there are a whole ton of people and systems and processes that end up being folded into that. Tom, same question to you. What's the biggest failure that you've seen related to P2P implementation over time?
I'm going to look at it more, I guess, holistically in terms of the themes that we see. When we meet with prospects, they've typically tried to implement P2P, and they're either talking to us about implementing our technology or implementing our managed service to kind of help them move the needle where they've struggled in the past. And what we see a lot is people implement P2P and they get 5 catalogs put up and then they're kind of done, right? And they never achieve the full ROI of the program. And the main driver there is they treat the project like it's a project, right? And it's really a program.
Yeah.
And then they need to think of P2P, and as Joe mentioned, end to end, and how are they going to care and feed for this once it's live, right? And it's a core part of their strategy, and managing the business and procurement and driving savings, but they treat it like a project. And I think if you come in thinking like it's a program and you think about the end state and what do we need to do to keep enabling this, and as our process changes, our spend change, as we buy another company, we're integrating more with suppliers, evolution, technology, you really need a team, a center of excellence that really is focused on driving adoption and continuous improvement beyond the 5 catalogs that you started with.
Absolutely. No, and that's great advice. Thinking maybe a little bit bigger, higher level as you go through. Jennifer, last but not least, what types of failures have you observed around P2P implementations?
I think that oftentimes it actually happens before you start the implementation. So where I've seen companies kind of go wrong is in the selection process, either going too quickly to pick a solution that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of the organization, or once they've actually made the selection, kind of jumping in too quick. And it kind of echoes what Tom and Joe mentioned, is a lot of it goes back to having a really solid plan in place, and making sure you have the right resources allocated, making sure that you actually understand the processes and the impacts that you're going to actually be putting into the technology before you jump in. You know, it's very common that when you make a decision to implement a solution like this, everybody gets really excited and they want to sort of jump in and move really quick. But that's where they go wrong, and they realize pretty quickly that by not necessarily defining the requirements up front of what they needed from the tool, they buy the wrong tool and then they implement the tool poorly because they haven't really thought through all of the components. So it does come back to change management and really just project planning and really stepping back and making sure you're really thinking through all of the aspects of what's going to go into the implementation and planning before you actually start doing anything.
So obviously there's a lot of commonality in terms of what tends to trip up teams and organizations as they go through this process. And as we were planning for today's session, we outlined sort of 3 core problems that companies run into. And we're going to start with the first of those 3, which is where procurement picks a solution that we think is best, but we don't actually stop to ask the business what they think, because they might give us feedback that's hard to accommodate, or they might slow us down. And so we sort of make the decision in a vacuum. And Joe, one of the questions that we received from a registrant during the process is from Sadia, and she asks, how can procurement include other relevant departments while staying focused on the procurement aspect of an implementation? So how do we let those other voices and perspectives come into the process, but don't let them knock us off our goals or our project plan?
Yeah, I really like that question, and I think it kind of in itself reflects maybe the wrong, not necessarily the wrong type of thinking, but maybe just a bit of a flaw in the way the question was asked, right? Because if you think about, I'm procurement, I just need to focus on the procurement aspect, that is the wrong way to approach a procure-to-pay transformation. Ultimately, the first thought you should be having is, why are we doing this for the business? What is the point of this for the business, right? Today's procurement should be a service organization. So when we decide to implement procure-to-pay, there's going to be a lot of benefits to that for procurement, and we're going to talk about some of those benefits later in terms of ROI and things like that. But the goal in itself should be, as much as it's aligned to procurement, it also has to be aligned to the business. And I would say, if you're not thinking about the business first, you're probably going down the wrong path. So
Yeah.
things like, following the procurement policy the easiest path for stakeholders and other interested parties. That's a key element of procure-to-pay. You should be thinking about that up front. Enabling the business to make better and easier buying decisions. That's super important. That's a key success metric when it comes to implementing procure-to-pay. And then, where it often starts is removing tactical approvals and reconciliations and the wrong types of approval paths, right? Where you're approving an invoice versus a PO, things like that, and then trying to reconcile against a budget. All those things can be fixed in P2P, but those are things that are really going to help the business do their job more quickly to make better and more informed decisions. So I would say, instead of thinking about how do I get their input but not get the project off track, I would say plan on getting their input and having that built into the project, that things may change because of the needs of the business and what the business brings to the table. There's going to be process changes. When you implement a technology like procure-to-pay, you're probably not going to want to keep the same process you had, because the process you had was built to be manual, to work around paper versus digitization, all these types of things. So Plan on there being process changes. Plan on there being training. Plan on there potentially being even staffing changes and restructuring, because if there's folks out in the business, different stakeholders that are doing procurement, that are doing invoice processing because it's such a manual and cumbersome process today, there's restructuring that may need to happen as part of a P2P deployment. So rather than saying, okay, we're going to accept these questions or these concerns, but we're not going to let our project go off track, the two things have to come together for the project to be successful. Otherwise, you may be on time and on budget, but when you roll it out, you're not going to get the adoption and the alignment with the business that you initially expected.
Yeah. And the reality is, we know, let's face it, we know if we go to the business and say, what is it that you truly want? They're going to say, we want to do it ourselves. So it's not necessarily not knowing the answer to the question that we're afraid of. It's that we know the answer, but until we hear it, maybe we don't have to deal with it. And Tom, this is a question that we also received in the registration process. This is from Mike. What role does guided buying, or some people also call it self-sourcing, play in world-class P2P implementations now and as we move into the future?
That's actually a really good question. And it does follow off of the theme that Joe started with, right, in terms of enabling the business.
Yeah.
And so you should be thinking about your P2P implementation as a framework and a process, right? And that there's a lot of definitions for guided buying, and you mentioned sourcing, but it's really just even simpler than that, right? It can start with just guiding people to the right place to buy things, right? So when you're structuring the tool, it might not always be about a bid, but if you're someone in operations and you're buying hundreds of different categories and things, and there's regional suppliers, local suppliers, there's national agreements, there's GPO marketplaces, how do you guide the person that's out in the field that needs to just buy something to easily find it, right? And how do you take all those stakeholders that are in different departments and think about what is their view of what they're trying to do and how do you enable them? So even just from a buying perspective without the bid process, you need to think about it in terms of guiding users to the right place really easily and efficiently. And then from a bid process, there is simple ways to do that, right? As a part of the guided buying process, when they're in the tool, it's all about critical mass and end-to-end process. So if I'm looking for something, I find it, I buy it. If I can't find what I need, what's my mechanism to solicit procurement to help me find the thing I need, or solicit procurement to help me with a bid, and really quick, fast, easy responses. Or I want to self-service, shop and source and find suppliers and bid it myself with a really simple process. And having that all in one place that's easy for the user to follow, right? If I'm going this path, this is what I do. If I'm going this path. And then in the future, we're starting to see, in our own platform, incorporation of AI to help guide users, different techniques in terms of collecting data from different stakeholders to guide them in the right direction. So that's where the future's headed. But I think if you're starting now, just keep thinking about it from the different stakeholders' perspective. And how are you going to structure things with the platform you have today to guide them to the right place?
Yeah. Now I have one follow-up for you, Tom, and then I'm going to come over to Helen and check in and see how the conversation is going with the audience. But before I do that, there were sort of two key pieces to today's conversation. One is, of course, it's the fun stuff, the problems and the failures. But ultimately, we're trying to work towards a number of different forms of ROI. And the first form that we come to is really, what should the ROI of a well-implemented P2P system be for the business as a whole? So Tom, if I can ask you to take that one, what should the overall enterprise ROI of P2P be?
Yeah, and we help our customers figure this out, right? As a part of, justifying the investment or working with us on managed services. And so it's really starting from, where you are today, and understanding of your spend, the spend you have under management. I know that sounds kind of historical, but it's really the right approach. And when you bring that into the platform, how much of it are you bringing in, and how decentralized are things today, right? And what are you going to try to get control over? So you may have all these contracts in place today and nobody's buying off them, right? And so we're going to push volume to the right places And so you're going to see savings. It's pretty easy. So there's the savings piece, right? Just hard quantifiable savings. And then there's a second level of savings off of that. As your spend increases in the right places, you can go back to market, right? And say, okay, now we're going to, renegotiate because we've tripled our volume. And then there's a lot of P card proliferation out there, right? It's the easiest way to buy, the easiest way to pay. Yeah. They start small, and pretty soon you've got $50 million, $100 million sitting on P card. And it's all about, ratcheting that down and making it easy for people to still buy things and pay for things, but doing it with the right providers. And what's the savings that comes from that? I mean, when we do our analysis, we'll even see preferred suppliers on P card, and they bought it off a website, right? So they paid list price, they used their P card, and now we're moving that into the right mechanism to leverage the negotiated pricing. And then there's that savings from the guided buying and spot bids, right? So you have all this spend that's kind of uncontrolled, and you're guiding people either to compete and negotiate on their own or use a managed service, shared service to support that. So those are all the layers of savings that you're building. And then Joe mentioned, I think, the efficiencies, right? Now you're driving efficiencies in the organization. And if you look at the process end to end, there's going to be efficiencies for people in procurement. There's going to be efficiencies for people in the field. And, if you're moving that bid process into the tool and you're shortening cycle times, whether procurement's doing it or the end users are self-servicing, and then potentially AP savings as well in terms of automation. So that's kind of the structure. I said a lot, but you can build from just core savings and then into efficiencies in the business.
But the fact that there's a lot means that there's a huge opportunity for procurement to provide value to the organization as a whole, as long as we get it right. So let me have us pause there, and I'm going to come over and check in with Helen. Helen, are there any questions that have come in from the audience that you want to direct to Joe, Tom, or Jennifer?
Yes, Kelly, and I think it's this setting yourself up for success theme that we started with the failure question on question one. And my question's to Jennifer, actually, and it's, Jennifer, you mentioned thinking through all the aspects, and a lot of the questions have been about, setting ourselves up to success. Is there a technique or a way of thinking or a process you use to try and make sure you've captured all those aspects? Because in a sense, what you don't know before you start. So is there any advice you can give our participants about a way to try and to get all those aspects down?
Yes, I think that the best way to go about it is sort of echoing what Joe and Tom have been saying in terms of understanding the needs of the business. It's really just, it's just as simple as sitting down and talking to them and asking. Sometimes we sort of assume that we know what the business wants or needs because we work with them every day, because they're our colleagues. But until you actually sit down and just ask the question, what keeps you up at night? What is causing the most pain in your day-to-day as it relates to this process? You'd be surprised what you find out. And that's sort of one of the fun parts of what I do in transformation, is just having these interviews with stakeholders, with suppliers, with executives, everybody, really doing a full 360 review, from the stakeholders' perspective in terms of where in the process it's breaking down for them and what is, detracting them from doing their job. And we basically take all of that information and then pull it together to paint that picture of success, because again, what we have to remember is who's going to be impacted by this tool. When we're implementing a contracting tool or a sourcing tool, your focal point is going to be a lot smaller. P2P, it's everyone in the organization. You buy something, you're impacted. So we need to listen to the people in the organization that are impacted. So when we put in place the technology and fix these processes, we can go back and say, we heard you. This is what you said. Here's how we fixed it. That alone will really set you up for success in terms of compliance and adoption when people just simply feel heard.
That's great. That's great advice, Jen. I think that ability to really listen to stakeholders and to translate that through, that's something that we've been talking about a lot, Kelly, at Art of Procurement, in terms of the procurement experience and the way people see us as a as part of the business and there to set them up to succeed. So thank you for that. That's great. I'll get back in the chat and keep the questions going.
Thank you, Helen. And Jennifer, actually staying with you to kick off our second official problem. I think this is a very common one. We go through this very detailed evaluation process where we look at all the different systems we could potentially implement. We pick the one that we think is the best, and then we spend the next 6 to 10 months trying to change it to do some other thing than what it was designed to do, right? So obviously, any implementation comes with a change management element. What would you say, Jen, about how the give and take should work between trying to maybe tweak a system a little bit so that it fits the processes that are in place, and how we know when it's actually the process and the habits existing in the organization that should change in order to match the system because it sort of has a way of embedding a best practice?
Right. So I think this actually plays very well off of the question I just answered from Helen, in that oftentimes those pain points that we're hearing from the stakeholder community, while they're really important to listen to, you have to be able to sort of see through them and see the problem behind the problem. We've talked about that before, where the areas of the process that are causing the most pain, the most noise, may not be actually indicative of the root cause problem. So for example, you think about AP, that's the end of the cycle where if things aren't working upstream, it starts to pile up and pile up and pile up. And then, of course, it's going to be the most painful in AP because of all the defects before that. So it's really important to understand where you can make corrections throughout the process, little tweaks here and there, so that when it gets to AP, you don't have to fix AP problems if they never get there, right? So it's thinking about it from that perspective and really evaluating where the processes are breaking down, and also understanding how many it's impacting on a day-to-day basis. Again, we always focus on AP, right? Because it's not just impacting the business's ability to run operations, but also that's where you're going to hear the most from your suppliers. They want to get paid, and if they're not getting paid, that's where you'll get the most noise, right? So that's again, I think that's why we end up hearing so much on that side. But it's really important to kind of listen up front and see where procurement and AP can partner to fix things throughout. When it comes to the technology, again, if you've defined your requirements up front and you've selected a system that meets the needs of your business in particular, and the processes you've already got to a degree, there shouldn't have to be as much sort of melding together of process and technology, or having to really break one down for another in order to fit with the other, right? It really goes back to picking a solution that is right for your organization without getting too narrow-minded in terms of there are a lot of niche solutions within industries, and I find that those organizations in those industries feel like I have to buy this solution because all my peers are buying this solution. May not be the right solution for you. So there's things you have to think about, not only in the present day of what you're doing now, but where you're going in the future, and is that solution going to be scalable?
Yeah. So apparently that solid mom advice not only holds true, but applies in procurement. If all of your friends are jumping off a bridge, right? Yes. We all know how that ends. Joe, if I can ask you a quick sort of extension of what Jennifer and I were just talking about. We think about there's AP, there's finance, there's actually distributed buyers that are being affected by P2P. And procurement might look at a change management effort from the perspective of, how do we need to be aware of this system changing their way of working? But do we need to stop also and think very consciously about how the system should or shouldn't change the way that we work and think? Does there need to be sort of an introspective element to not only the system selection, but also the implementation process?
Oh, absolutely. And it's a great time to rethink really holistically everything about your procurement organization. We often talk, we're not talking about it too much today, but we often talk about the value and perception of procurement. And as you're moving towards a P2P transformation or just an implementation of a technology, procurement should be thinking about, what is my day job today? What do I spend most of my time doing? And how is that going to change once this technology is in place if it's done right, right? If you think about, enablement of straight through processing, from requisition all the way through to invoice and payment. Well, that means there's going to be less, shuffling of paperwork around approvals, levels of, authority, things like that. Are you using the right supplier? It's all in the system now. So if there's a self-service mode or a guided buying mode, you don't need to be doing that. So you can start thinking about what are the strategic things procurement should be doing that we haven't? How do we better engage the business? Do we have the right skill sets in place to do that? These things are all part of an implementation, should be thought about, and oftentimes they're secondary to the technology implementation itself. Yeah. But the earlier you think about it, the better off you're going to be.
So then, given that, because there are obviously the direct benefits coming from having well-implemented P2P in place, but then there's also the way it changes procurement's thinking about the role in the organization and how they're perceived. At the end of the last problem, Tom talked to us about ROI enterprise-wide. What would you then say, Joe, about either the forms or types of ROI that procurement directly should expect to receive?
Sure, and there's to that end, there's quantitative and there's qualitative ROI, right? Hard dollars. I'll give a great metric for folks. Your P2P implementation should produce a 10x ROI from a hard dollar savings over cost perspective, and that's a minimum. And we see it almost every time we deploy it. So where is that hard dollar ROI coming from? Predominantly, it's being driven through value capture and savings, and that's the traditional models. And Tom alluded to a few of these before, but yeah. Getting the business to buy from preferred suppliers. So procurement or sourcing has done their work, right? They've gone out, they've contracted, they've gotten best-in-class pricing and terms from suppliers, but the business hasn't been buying from those suppliers. So it's about value capture. The technology will help them buy from the right suppliers, making the right choices at the right time. And I'll tell you, our procurement-led P2P implementations, that's often where they start, is let's solve for this problem. We've got good contracts, but the business doesn't have proper access to them. And then it kind of leads to the next thing, which is, the better controls that you have in place and more people issuing recs and POs, and the approval process happening there, that leads to early insight into expenditures. What is the business trying to buy versus at the invoice when it's already happened? That leads to true spend under management, which generates savings, and it allows procurement to start getting more proactive in helping the business make decisions, right? If you see a PO come through for a product or service that hasn't been purchased before, or for something that meets a certain threshold, and you can engage that business early on and say, hey, we have something here that might be helpful to you, or have you thought about X, Y, and Z? That's proactive versus seeing it on an invoice and saying, are you going to do this again? If so, let us know, and maybe we can help you. And so spend under management is incredibly useful metric to drive value capture for the business. Plus efficiency gains, right? Straight through processing, I mentioned that earlier, but if you think about measuring and maximizing straight through processing, which means once a requisition is hit, the workflow kind of works itself through the system and an invoice is paid with minimal touches along the way. There's efficiency gains there that are real hard dollar efficiency gains. If you think about resources that are no longer needed, that we're doing the manual work that the technology does today, either those resources being redeployed or used for other things, that's a hard dollar savings that should be quantified as part of a implementation and the ROI calculated there. And then there's to your point, the qualitative. And there is qualitative ROI, because if the system is put in place the right way and we do all the things that we've been talking about how we engage the business, you can start by, a new metric you might want to measure is customer satisfaction. Right? How does the business feel about the system, and how does the business feel about procurement? And as you see that value or that perception go up, you now have the ability to engage the business at a higher level. Instead of business seeing us as a compliance officer or a group that challenges them in terms of what they're spending money on. Now they're seeing us as an enabler, helping them get work done. Now we're being brought into projects earlier. Now we're being given bigger roles in big projects. And so there's that qualitative ROI that ties to the value or perception of procurement, and then ultimately how we can better help the business on a go-forward basis because the tactical and operational needs have been addressed so well.
Now, one of the questions I want to ask, which I think makes an interesting connection between, Tom, the way you were talking about enterprise ROI, and Joe, the way you were just talking about procurement ROI in all its forms. You know, when you think about customer satisfaction, the first thing that always comes to mind for me is that continuum of smiley to sad faces that you see when you're in an average doctor's office, right? You have everything from like red, crying, eyes are going kind of funny, all the way up to like the traditional yellow, happy, smiley face. Tom, you talked about basically benchmarking, right? Figure out where you are at the beginning of the process around performance, around satisfaction, all those things. Do you feel like in the big picture or over the longer term, it's important for procurement to be very transparent? The ghost in the system muted me, doesn't want me to talk about this anymore. Do we need to be honest with the executive team about where we are, maybe in terms of how distributed buyers feel about the system, so that we can demonstrate improvement over time? To what extent should we take kind of the forms of feedback that Joe was just talking about and bring those back into conversations to try to help shape and improve the way that leadership views and values procurement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that leads to kind of the innovation mindset, right? And continuous improvement in understanding where you are and having, you know, the talent to continually grow and improve what you're doing today. And Joe talked about that a little bit, right? Just how do we pivot procurement from the traditional role and look forward and how the role is changing based on implementing technologies. Yeah, and then be honest with yourself where you are and how you need to adapt and change and you know, build your organization and build the skills in the organization to keep addressing the needs. And the needs are different, right? What folks in corporate services need from a P2P tool and a guided buying tool are really different than maybe people in operations. And so continuing to have that conversation and involve your understanding of the business and where platforms like this are taking things, so you can keep stretching the reach of this process deeper and deeper into the organization and have those satisfied stakeholders.
Now, for our third problem, we need to move on to a group of organizations that are incredibly important that we haven't discussed too much yet. We've talked about overall enterprise and leadership. We've talked about procurement and the different functions that we interact with. But problem number 3 with P2P implementations is that we forget to talk to the suppliers. So Jennifer, let me come to you for this question. And this was actually submitted during registration from Laxman. The process for onboarding suppliers often comes with long cycle times and a heavy data entry or data management lift. How can we make sure supplier needs are being addressed before selecting and implementing a solution so that we don't just get stuck dealing with sort of the fallout from a cumbersome onboarding process?
Right, and I think there's a few different things to think about from the supplier perspective. And I have to agree too, when we were talking about this, it's such a critical component that even I wasn't in the forefront of when I was thinking about problems with the implementation. So I think it was a really good call out. Anytime that you're implementing a solution like this, it's important to take that step back, like we were saying, and see where you are, understand where you're going, because putting in place even just a basic procure-to-pay system, you need to have certain processes and elements in place in the organization to be effective in this. And I think one aspect of it is having just a really solid understanding of your supply base. So knowing who your suppliers are, where you're spending with them, how they fall into any kind of a segmentation it doesn't have to be anything really sophisticated, or you don't have to have a really robust supplier relationship management program, but at least having an understanding of, how the spread is, and how many recurring suppliers you have, preferred suppliers, because they're going to be a really key component to how you roll out the system and when you onboard certain suppliers. It also impacts, do you need any other tools to effectively onboard those suppliers that would bolt on to the P2P or become a part of the, having a portal. How sophisticated does that portal need to be based on the business requirements you have? For example, as we've talked about a lot lately, if you have a supplier diversity program, you're going to need certain components built into a portal so you can collect that information up front instead of having to chase it later on down in the process. So again, just having that understanding of what your key processes are today and the requirements you need, and a really solid understanding of the supplier segmentation. Another thing I see too, when organizations are going to implement a P2P and they take a look at their supply base and say, we understand that there's going to be certain suppliers that may not have the sophistication to use this technology, just local small suppliers. And I see a lot of times they get this sort of approach that's, either, they're going to be able to do it or we won't use them anymore. We'll have to move away from them. We'll have to do something different. And I struggle with that approach, again, because of the diverse supplier, small business mindset, is that when you just don't consider those suppliers anymore because they can't meet your needs, that sort of creates a problem in and of itself. So we need to make sure that when we're looking at that supplier segmentation and we're looking at the suppliers we have in place today, it's about how do we build a strategy that will meet the needs of each of those buckets of suppliers, because there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach to how you onboard these suppliers. And yes, it's going to be great when you have the more sophisticated suppliers that can get onto the tool quicker and it's less effort for you to worry about them, but that doesn't mean ignore the ones that are going to be a heavier lift for you. It's just a matter of putting in place a different change management strategy. It just, and again, making sure that they have the right communication and training, because I find that, same problem you have internally with getting the right level of adoption and compliance is that if you don't pay attention to making sure the suppliers understand the technology and how to use it, it may not be a matter of sophistication. It could be just training and showing them the right way to do it, but also making sure that you know your suppliers and their needs. So when you're thinking about the workflows in your tool, you're not just thinking about it from the business perspective, but what's going to help your suppliers get on quicker and help you run the business better, right?
Yeah. Now, it's interesting you sort of compare the process of how things roll out internally to what it needs to be like as we onboard suppliers. And obviously during the implementation and even the selection process, procurement can look at the supplier interface. We can think about how it's going to change our current process, even potentially how will it fix known issues with our current process. Is that enough, though? Can we truly look at things through supplier eyes, or should there almost be a supplier onboarding pilot, maybe with a few trusted organizations, just like we would potentially roll things out gradually on the internal buy side? Is there value in having actual real life suppliers look at the solution and give us feedback around the process, or is that just not realistic?
Very realistic. I mean, we often have a lot of close partners, suppliers that have grown with us over time that would actually be happy to do that. I've seen that happen in a lot of organizations in a lot of different ways. So not just when it comes to system implementations, but anytime you're trying to innovate something new and you have a really great partner, you're both going to benefit from this advancement. So just having a really good partnership like that says, hey, can you help me so I can help you? And a good partner will definitely see that. Because we do the same thing internally, right? When we're trying to push out a new process or system, it's about finding those cheerleaders internally that we know are going to be supportive and really take a look at things objectively and not worry too much about getting distracted with things that might impact them. Same thing should go with your suppliers. I think that's a fantastic idea, in fact, to make sure that you really thought through all the aspects of that end user experience from their side. Sure.
Now, I have one more question for you, Jennifer, around the supplier piece, and then I'll come to Helen to see how the conversation is going in the chat. Now, Joe earlier talked about the fact that pesky suppliers are constantly wanting to be paid. So assuming no P2P platform can magically fix how soon suppliers want to be paid, Jennifer, what would you say the forms of supplier-oriented ROI look like from a P2P implementation?
Sure, and obviously I understand getting paid quicker is theoretically one of those components, but if you think about that piece, it's not just that simple of having a system in place. It's about having rationalized payment terms and the right contract terms, and there's a lot of other process mechanisms that certainly go into making sure that you get that ROI side of it. But I also think it's just about visibility, and this is a point that I've seen recently, and it's really top of mind to me. Is, you know, suppliers want to know where things are at in the process. They want to be able to have visibility into, you know, where their orders are, where their invoices are, if there's receipts, that sort of thing. So many solutions out there offer these, but if you don't spend enough time training the suppliers and reinforcing that, I mean, think about this. So supplier relationships, it's all about relationships, supplier management. So the first thing that suppliers do is they call the person they know best, that they know is going to pick up the phone and answer their question. It's much easier to do that than to go in and try to figure out how to work the solution. So it's about having a really strong front and communicating back to the supplier that this is in the system. Let me show you how to do it so you can get it next time. Otherwise, that phone will never stop ringing, and they'll never go and learn how to do it themselves. Yeah. There's so many portals, you know, like I said, the supplier portal that they can have access to, and that's what you should look for as well, is wherever there's as much that the supplier can be enabled by going in themselves and finding things that alleviates not only the procurement and AP teams from additional support and effort, but again, it gives the supplier the freedom and autonomy to go in and do things themselves, which I think is a huge ROI, as opposed to when you're doing it completely manually. You have to pick up the phone to figure out where things are at.
Yeah. Well, and it's realistic to expect that if distributed buyers want to do it themselves, probably suppliers want to do it themselves as well. Let me pause there, Helen, and check in with you. Any interesting comments or questions that have come out from your perspective in the chat?
Yeah, Kelly, there's a couple. I think I'll start with one for Joe, and it builds on you talked about straight through processing. And there's a question here about sort of policies and governance that sit alongside that and the work that we need to do to support that straight through processing. Have you got any examples or any ways you can bring that to life, just in terms of what that might entail in order to get the straight through lane clear and we can motor on through?
Sure. Yeah, I would say, step one, anytime you're looking to implement procure to pay, take a fresh set of eyes on your procurement policy, right? What is the process you want stakeholders to use to buy and to make buying decisions? And then look at it at the vein of, how do I make this process that I'm building tied to the policy easier to follow than the alternative, which would be non-compliant buy, right? I mean, worst case, that means them going out with a P card and spending money. Hopefully that's the exception for your organization, not the rule, because when that's what the standard is, it's very hard to change that process, which is super easy, to any process that involves filling out a rec, a PO, going into a system and ordering. But with that mindset, how do I make this process easier to follow than the alternative? You can build a process that and embed that in the technology that makes it super intuitive, not too many clicks, not too many levels of approval, and that what they put in the system will match what comes back on an invoice, which means no touch. So that would be my starting point when you think about how do I maximize straight through processing, would be how do I make a super easy and intuitive process that's not too overcomplicated.
Mm-hmm. That's great. It sounds like we can have a good clear out of some of those roadblocks as we go along there. So that's good. My other question from the chat is one that was posed by Din, and he was talking about some really specific categories of spend, but I wanted to broaden it out slightly, and it's probably to you, Jen, this one, which is, are there any particular categories or types of suppliers where implementing P2P is harder, and what's your advice there? I'm thinking about, well, you covered it a little bit. I'll perhaps leave it open to you, because Din's question was very specific, I think, to his the organisation he works in. He was talking about livestock supplies and things like that. But I think broaden it out. Is there anything, you know, where we just need to be aware that these are a little bit more challenging in terms of onboarding, or even getting on the catalogue side, or on that side of things?
Right. I think it's, again, ties back to it's supplier sophistication, supplier size, those sort of things that really impact, less category specific, because you can be in one particular category and have a very large supplier that can get onto these systems pretty easily, and a very small supplier that might struggle a bit more. So that's where I think I tend to focus, is the sophistication of the supplier and what enables them. What you also find is, if there's a lot of local branches of a supplier, that might make things a bit more challenging. How do they tie back to the parent company? How does it tie into the catalog? So again, it really just comes down to understanding who your current suppliers are and how you buy as an organization, and then building a strategy around the different segments of suppliers so that you understand the pain points. And to Kelly's point earlier, maybe you look at when you're building out your change management plan, you look at those different segments of suppliers and see where you can anticipate the biggest areas of risk, and select those for the ones that would help pilot, right? Instead of going with the ones that might seem more obvious, the bigger ones that understand the tool, let's go with the ones that don't understand the tool and use it as a lever to both educate them and ourselves at the same time, and build up a partnership that when you do roll out the tool, you have more cheerleaders, so to speak, as I mentioned, in the supply base. So again, I think it's going to depend on the different business and whether it's more, you know, commodity focused or service focused, but ultimately it comes down to the different types of suppliers you have.
And it sounds to me like, you know, one of the things there is about trying to do the hard work of the change process, where you've got the energy at the start of the project, and perhaps finishing with the ones that you know are going to be quite easy, rather than the other way round. So that's quite an interesting thing to mull over, I think. Thanks for that.
I think it's a blend, right?
Thank you. Thanks, Kelly.
Thank you, Helen. So as we start to kind of round up our time, the last two questions that I have, I actually want to go to each one of you to get your perspective. And the first one, so we'll go with kind of the same order we did earlier, Joe, Tom, and then Jennifer. But starting with you, Joe, when you think about all of the implementations that you've seen, potentially in some cases probably even been brought in to help with an implementation that, you know, maybe they started with one solution and they had to change directions and go with something else, you may be in a corrective situation. What is it that allows you as a third party coming in to actually help a team? What do you see from the teams that are the best at leveraging your knowledge and experience and input so that you can actually help them have a bigger impact?
I would say the ones where we're most successful and have the best result are where the customer goes into the implementation understanding it's not going to be easy, right? I don't want to make people think that procure to pay transformations are easy. They really aren't. I think, Jennifer, you mentioned ERPs earlier. The reality is it's one step down from an ERP deployment. And so for us to be successful, if a customer is coming in with an oversimplified idea of what this means, they're going to get a result. And it's the result that a lot of our customers have when we start one of these projects, which is, yeah, they have P2P. There's 5 catalogs out there somewhere that people can access and buy from, and there's hardly any adoption tied to it. You can get that done pretty quickly, but there's not a lot of value driven through that process. And so thinking about it holistically, thinking about it from the stakeholders, as well as the suppliers, as Jen was talking about earlier, and that holistic model, how do I improve as part of this? Those are the ones that are also most willing to hear about, okay, the change management aspects, the rethinking process, the rethinking policy, and taking that holistic approach to a P2P transformation, which is really what is necessary to get the result that you're looking for.
Tom, what would you, from your perspective, add to what Joe just shared? What do you observe in the companies, the teams, the procurement leaders that position themselves to succeed by truly leveraging the best that you bring to the engagement?
Yeah, I think it's the relationships across the business, right? I think if procurement's trying to mandate this in the business, it's probably not going to succeed very well. And where we've seen the best success is where CPO, VP of procurement is building really strong relationships with VP of operations, VP of corporate services, CFO. So at the executive level, because the savings here are huge, right? And these typically can even go to like board level approvals in terms of the savings and the expense to implement broadly, right? Not just the 5 catalog implementation. But having that alignment on the benefits to the org, the benefit to the people in each department, and then, you know, collaboratively having steering committee meetings, driving the change. When we work across the business and not just are confined to procurement, we tend to see really successful implementations that go much more quickly.
Excellent. And Jennifer, same question to you. What positions you to be most successful on behalf of the companies that you work with?
So I'm trying not to go with the obvious of plan and look at your process first, as we've talked about throughout today. But I think it's making sure that you stay true to why you started out on this journey to begin with. So it's, you know, looking at those pain points, understanding the needs of the business, and just reiterating as you're going through this process. And when you complete the process, is here's what we set out to achieve. Here's what we achieved, and here's what we're going to continue to focus on as we go forward, because as Tom mentioned, it's a program, it's an evolution. It's not just a one-stop, put it in place and walk away. It's making sure that it's continuously improved over time, and that you're really revisiting all of the workflows as the business grows, and making sure that it still meets your needs over time, but ultimately that you're getting what you paid for, that you got the solution that you intended to get, and it's having the results that you expected.
Now, as I mentioned when we started our session today, we did things reverse. We started with sort of like the key takeaways, the crisis things to avoid, the failures that you guys have seen. But we want to end on a note that's not only positive, but action-oriented. You know, we like to talk about taking action here at Art of Procurement. So let me go around one more time. Again, Joe, starting with you. What is something concrete? You know, we've talked about methodologies, we've talked about process, we've talked about policy, but what is something concrete that a procurement team can do at the start of either a P2P implementation or the start of a selection process for P2P that you think will ultimately position them to be successful through that implementation journey and then beyond as they roll it out and use it?
Sure. So we've all talked a lot about engaging outside of procurement. So the concrete step I would say you can take is, as you're starting down this road, go to the business, find out where their pain points are, write them down, create business outcomes that you want to solve for based on their feedback, and then at the end of the project, have that benchmark, measure it, and show results against it. I can't tell you how many times the original reasons a procure-to-pay transformation started are forgotten.
Yeah.
Because we just don't write them down, because things change so much over time. You learn, you evolve, you adapt. But you always go back to that starting point, and the business, here's what the business told us, and here's what we're doing about it. If you can show that, then you will be successful.
And we do function in a visual world, right? As much as everything is digital and we're emailing and Slacking and all of those things, I can almost envision the power of the moment where, whether it's a photocopy or a picture of the whiteboard that everybody was brainstorming on, with that check, 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 check right down the list, right? Like we've satisfied all of those things. And plus it will help keep procurement and finance and AP and operations and everybody else on track, so that you don't sort of lose your way during the implementation. Tom, let me come to you. What's a concrete piece of advice or action step that you would recommend companies take?
Yeah, I'm going to, I guess, go back to where we started, and it's not to view this as a project, right?
Mm.
Where someone's going to come in, implement something with you, and then they're going to leave, and then everything's going to be fine, right? It's really a program. It's core to your strategy in procurement. And then look at your team that you have today. And if work's going to shift, how are you shifting people? And what does the end state team look like that supports this, keeps driving innovation, looks at next levels of technology? And maybe you're only getting 50% of the spend under management. How do you continue to evolve, to work with other stakeholders and other departments to keep refining the solution, right? It may not be a one size fits all. And if you try that, you may not get the adoption, right? So I would think of it as a program, and then what's the end state team post implementation? Like, what's the team for implementation, and then post implementation, what's our structure to keep driving success?
Excellent. And Jennifer, you get to have the last word. What's an action step, a piece of advice, something concrete that procurement can do now to make themselves not fall into these 3 problem traps that we talked about today?
I think it's just simply having some sort of mechanism to communicate with the stakeholders and suppliers throughout the implementation and afterwards in a very concise and clear way, more often than you would think. So celebrating like little milestones and successes. Again, if you've written down those pain points and you're able to drive the outcomes from those, it's, hey, we just kicked off and our implementation team is fantastic. Just wanted you to know, little things like that. We've got a really great project team. We're really, we're rolling out the first wave of suppliers, and this is how it impacts you. And just so you know, make sure that your suppliers call us, that sort of thing. Just open communication and often, but also be mindful of the culture of the organization too. If you're just kind of weighed down by newsletters coming out every day, you don't want this sort of announcement to get lost in everything else. So figure out something that people are actually going to pay attention to. And it might mean, putting a little extra effort in by recording a video once a week or something, just to get people's attention, but keep it concise and short, and keep it on a positive note, but also make sure that if there are any potential risks, you're communicating those as well. We don't want it to seem like all sunshine and roses if it's not really.
Absolutely. No, and this is one of those cases where surprises are bad, right? There are no good surprises associated with any kind of tech implementation.
If this episode struck a chord with you, please do send it to somebody. We grow here at Art of Procurement through word of mouth, and that would be really appreciated. You can also support us by giving us a thumbs up, a star rating, or a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. Since 2015, we've built the world's largest free resource for procurement professionals looking to elevate their impact. Our resources span podcasts like this, videos, blog posts, papers, and events. To join us on the inside and to ensure you never miss an episode, a webinar, event, or a post, please do subscribe to our weekly newsletter, This Week in Procurement. You can do that at artofprocurement.com/subscribe. That's artofprocurement.com/subscribe. Thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.